What's up, guys? It's your boy Fan Death. Today I got a new video. It's about a pretty interesting topic. So basically the kind of inspiration for this video came from Facebook. So here is the meme. In 1998, Blade, #Blade, earned $131.2 million at the box office, saving Marvel and opening a door to all superhero movies we enjoy today. 100. So I want to answer the question, is this statement true? And so basically you have two statements here, which is that Blade's $131.2 million at the box office saved Marvel, and Blade's $131.2 million at the box office opened the door for the superhero movies that we enjoy today. That's two separate questions, and we're going to answer them both. So let's start with the first one. Did the $131.2 million that Blade made at the box office, and that's actually an accurate number, did that save Marvel? So let's give background and then we'll get into the questions. Okay, so who is Blade? Blade is a character that was created in 1973. His first appearance was in The Tomb of Dracula #10. His real name is Eric Brooks. In his original iteration or original incarnation, Blade didn't have any powers. Well, he had one, which is immunity to vampirism. But other than that, his normal abilities were essentially that he was a good martial artist. He was good with bladed handheld weapons like knives. He was like a master of knives. And then that was it. He was immune to vampirism. His appearance originally and his style was based off of black celebrities in the United States at the time. His speech and language was very heavily influenced by blaxploitation movies. His outfit and his costume or whatever also was very much blaxploitation movie, maybe aside from like the motorcycle boots. He also did not carry a sword originally. He was kind of a master knife wielder, and he wielded wooden knives. He also had stakes that he carried. Something that was very strange about the fact that he spoke jive originally is the fact that he's British. So they basically kind of took Blade out of his own element and made him very American-ish, even though he was supposed to be a British character. The writer actually removed him from the storylines that he was writing. Blade was always a side character, so he was taken out of the story because the writer felt like he wasn't authentic. He was, again, he was this jive talking kind of parody of a black person, and he wanted to write it more authentic. So he took him out, got woke a little bit, and then wrote a better character. Which was a benefit to Blade. Blade's first solo appearance came in Marvel Preview #3, and then, if I remember correctly, he had a second solo appearance in Marvel Preview #10, and then he wasn't solo again until the 90s. And then Blade had a 10-issue limited series called Blade the Vampire Hunter. And that was it up until the point where Blade actually appeared in the Blade movie in 1998. As the meme said, the movie saved Marvel. So to actually put that into context, we'll start with 1991. X-Men #1 had released and gone on to become the largest selling comic book of all time, a title which it still holds. So in 1996, Marvel files for bankruptcy, and that's basically rock bottom for them. Just over 4 short years, Marvel had gone from having the largest selling comic book of all time to being in such big trouble that they had to file for bankruptcy. So this is 96, and the question is, did the release of Blade in 1998 and the success of Blade become what saved Marvel? So here are the facts. The movie license for Blade was sold to New Line Cinema in 1992, back when Marvel was doing relatively well. In fact, Marvel sold a number of licenses to properties in that year, and Marvel had also done a major deal with Toy Biz to give them exclusive licensing rights on the toys that Marvel produces. So in 1992, Marvel also had a really great year, at least on the business side of things. However, when you look at the deal for Blade, Marvel didn't really come out with much. Because of Blade's history, Blade just was not a character that was used very much. Midnight Suns was going on at the time, so Blade was being printed, he was being utilized some, but there's entire swaths of his 20-year history at the time, he'd been around for about 20 years, where Blade didn't appear in any comics at all. So I said all that to say this: Marvel essentially did not really see the value of Blade and basically gave the character away. There's a very credible source who has come out in more recent years who said that Marvel had made less than $100,000 off of the licensing of Blade to New Line. In between that time and the release of Blade, Marvel did file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 1996, and then they merged with the company Toy Biz in 1997, which is actually what saved them from going out of business altogether. So it was the bankruptcy itself and the merger with Toy Biz combined that made Marvel solvent and allowed them to restructure in a way that allowed them to start earning money again. So by the time the Blade movie came out, Marvel was doing okay, even if they were in a situation to where Blade was going to make them some sort of profit. The times of turmoil had already passed. It would have legitimately been profit. So on to the second question and the little meme that we're looking at. Did Blade open the door to all superhero movies we enjoy today? Currently, superhero movies are very popular. The MCU exists, the DCEU exists. The genre has exploded over the past 20 or so years. The idea is that we went from a time, especially in 1998, when no superhero movies were being made. Blade comes out, and then now superhero movies are being made. Most people agree almost unilaterally that X-Men and then Spider-Man are what led to the boom of modern superhero film. Prior to X-Men that came out in 2000 and Spider-Man that came out in 2002, superhero movies weren't being taken seriously. Mid to late 80s, we saw Marvel released 3 feature-length movies, and these were technically the first movies that were produced for the big screen. And those movies were Howard the Duck, Punisher, and then Captain America. And then a 4th movie was to come later, which was Fantastic Four. So those 4 movies were going to be Marvel's leap into licensing out their properties for films. Howard the Duck was atrocious. Then we get to Dolph Lundgren's Punisher. It ends up having some difficulties in production, ends up going straight to DVD. So Howard the Duck was a failure. Punisher ends up being a failure. Captain America also goes straight to DVD. And then the Fantastic Four movie is riddled with issues and ends up never even being released, not even to DVD. So at this time, Marvel had completely struck out with all movie prospects, licensing out their characters for movies. Movies produced for the big screen ended up all pretty much being failures. So going to 1989, which is also the year the Punisher movie came out, Batman was released and did exceptionally well. The movie did phenomenal at the box office. It is a very popular movie. It was well received by the public, etc. Then we had Batman Returns in 1992, actually a very successful and very well done movie. That was followed up by Batman Forever, not as popular of a movie. And then Batman and Robin was to this day is universally panned. It was not very well received by anyone. So after 2 failures for the Batman series, big budget action movies, big time talent were in those movies, Hollywood didn't trust superhero films. Then Blade comes out a year after Batman and Robin. It's a comic book property that does relatively well. A low budget film that turned a pretty good profit. It being a comic book property, it rekindled the trust in the comic book genre or the superhero genre, and therefore would mean that they would trust to make more movies, like, for example, X-Men, which came out in 2000. However, there are some problems. Firstly, that Blade was never intended to be a superhero film. So going back in time a little bit, when the license to Blade was bought by New Line, the intentions there were to do something different with the vampire genre. Up until that point, vampires had mostly been a single monster horror flick. So you would have Dracula, for example, Nosferatu, classic horror films made from these properties. Bram Stoker's Dracula, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, even Lost Boys had kind of breathed fresh life into the vampire genre. So there was a lot of new ideas being brought out, and New Line kind of wanted to get into that. So they wanted to do a vampire parody film, and that's what Blade was originally intended to be. David S. Goyer, who was selected to write the movie, had recently sat down with Wesley Snipes, and they unilaterally agreed that Blade should not be some sort of a parody. And so what Goyer wrote is the script that we have today. The mentality of Goyer going into that movie was not a superhero film. In fact, if you go back to Blade at the time was still not a superhero. His only powers at the time were the fact that he could not be turned into a vampire. He was immune to vampirism. Blade didn't have powers in the comics. The powers that he had in the movie were actually the ideas of Goyer. His powers were in essence that he was a vampire that could walk in the day. So even then, he was not written as a superhero. He was written as a good monster in essence. Blade actually in the comics today does have essentially the Blade from the movie's powers, but those were given to him by Morbius in 1999. That turned him into the Blade that we have today, which is the Daywalker. So essentially, the comics followed the movie in creating those powers for Blade, not vice versa. So David S. Goyer is somewhat responsible for Blade having powers in the comics. But again, Blade was not a superhero. He just wasn't. The movie wasn't written as a superhero film. It wasn't created and produced as a superhero film. It wasn't marketed as a superhero film. It wasn't distributed as a superhero film. Blade was not a superhero film, and therefore it could not be what led to the superhero genre per se. There are some things that Blade did do. The argument that Blade is a comic book property, Blade being a superhero in the comics, makes a movie about him a superhero movie. It doesn't fit the mold of what we'd seen prior to Blade as far as superhero movies go. The superhero films after Blade, the more modernized take on superhero films, wherein the reality that they're in seem like the real world, the rules of the real world applied to them, things like the media mattered, politics mattered. Those sorts of things are a relatively new storytelling style for superhero movies. To say that Blade brought those elements in, I would say is a somewhat of a valid argument. But Blade was not the first comic book property to do those things. And I would argue that the comic book property that did those things prior to Blade was MIB. MIB came out a whole year before Blade did. It was far more popular. It was far more successful internationally. It was just a more well-received movies. Licensing and merchandising was much better, etc., etc., etc. The Men in Black franchise eclipsed Blade in overall reception. And therefore, if you're going to say a comic book property led to modern superhero films, that type of storytelling style, I believe, started with, in my opinion, started with MIB even before it got to Blade. But neither of those movies were actually marketed as superhero films. So to me, the claim is false in that sense. So here are my final thoughts. I think Blade legitimately contributed to the current vampire slayer, mystical or supernatural hunter style movies and television shows. Characters like Constantine, characters like Sam and Dean, even shows like Vampire Diaries, who take a different spin on the vampire genre to vampires in the real world. I think those movies legitimately took a lot from Blade, and I think Blade did pave the way for that genre in a very big way, especially early on when you saw movies like Vampires, which were almost carbon copies of Blade with all the leather and all of that type of stuff. Most definitely there. I believe that along with MIB and Independence Day, Blade is a movie that helped to reinforce the idea that a black male lead for a summer action blockbuster was viable, because that, prior to that, that's just something we weren't seeing. I believe again that, along with those other films, it definitely did change the narrative when it comes to that type of a movie. But to answer the question, did Blade save Marvel? No. Did Blade lead to the emergence of the superhero genre that we have today. Also know it did exist in that time to where its success definitely galvanized things for Marvel. Blade definitely gave Marvel a moral victory, feeling like their characters were viable. Even B-list characters were viable options for the big screen. So yes, in that way, Blade may have given Marvel the confidence to start working towards the MCU that we see today. I could actually agree with that argument if you say, okay, giving Marvel a moral victory in 1998 led to the MCU 10 years later. I'd say it definitely gave it a small and gentle push, but a push just the same because of Blade. If you Google the Blade script and then, Control F for the word hero, it doesn't even exist in the movie. And I think everybody really understands that. Blade is definitely not a superhero film, just like MIB is not a superhero film. They're very enjoyable. They have a very massive fan base, pop culture relevance, etc., 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 but they did not usher in the current wave of superhero movies. They were entertaining for what they were, but MIB is most definitely a science fiction, and Blade is definitely a action, maybe even an action horror. Let me know what you guys think. If you guys disagree, tell me your reasons in the comments. Sounds good. I love a great debate. If you disagree, most definitely put that in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, hit the bell icon, all that good stuff, and we'll see you next time.